Hello and welcome to Critical Weight Theory and my show within a show that I call Reply To. And this is a bit of a special episode because I'm actually replying to somebody who is making a critique, at least ostensibly, from the left of one of my recent episodes. So this is from Den Zero, spelled Denxero, and their critique goes like this: American liberalism and Obama's BS reforms are extremely closer to fascism than you allow yourself to think. At the very least, they were a gigantic giveaway to parasitic slash profiteering capital and an absolute joke from the POV of actual publicly funded healthcare as a public service, part of the state's obligations towards its citizenry. If you want to be relevant, you need to ditch the milquetoast bourgeois liberal faux progressivism and dive neck deep into Marxism-Leninism. That right wing claim has way more merit than you think. Of course, it's ghastly incomplete regarding the communist description, zero shocker there, and I acknowledge this as a full blown and unrepeating communist. So that's the end of the comment. And if you want more context, you can look at my last reply to video if you want to know more exactly what he's talking about with his reference to a right wing claim, because I was actually responding to a right winger. And let's get into this. So you can respond to this message, this sort of critique, without defending Obamacare as perfect and without accepting the fascism label. And the key is to separate three different claims that are being blended together. So the first claim is the ACA helped private insurers. That's the first one, the first statement. The second is it wasn't real public health care. The third one, therefore, it's close to fascism. That's the third basic premise that this response is getting into. And, I will say before I really dive in, it is a little bit strange to be, called somebody who's offering a milquetoast bourgeois liberal faux progressive perspective, because my video was not, praising Obamacare. In fact, I actually went out of my way to critique it. I said that it was definitely not ideal. And I even opened the door to the possibility that you could, say that it's relatively fascistic compared to other systems or whatever, because, the term fascism and the term communism, they're relative terms. You can throw them around in all sorts of different ways and basically render them meaningless. So, only the first two claims are arguable policy critiques that this person made, and the third doesn't follow, at least not exactly, and you need to make sort of a compelling argument to convince me that, the claim that Obamacare is really close to fascism, you have to really convince me of that with a solid argument. And so I'm going to go with the first claim. It was a giveaway to profiteering capital. So there is a reasonable left wing critique here, so I'm not trying to deny that. The ACA preserved private insurers rather than replacing them with a single payer system. It required people to buy insurance while leaving insurers intact. So, from a socialist perspective, that can look like entrenching capital. But that is technically not necessarily fascism. All right? And I'm going to get into why there's a significant degree of separation. In fascist systems, private capital is subordinated to an authoritarian state and integrated into its political structure. Industry serves nationalistic, militarized, or regime preservation goals. So independent labor movements are crushed, political opposition is suppressed. The ACA did none of that directly, all right? It regulated insurers, expanded Medicaid, subsidized low income consumers, banned pre existing condition exclusions, capped profit margins through medical loss ratio rules. Ratio rules. Boy, I'm tongue twisted here. And it also imposed new taxes on parts of the healthcare industry. And to be clear, insurers fought many of those provisions. So it actually wasn't as big of a gift to them as some people might think. Now it was still obviously a bit of a gift to them, but they did not accept gladly all of the provisions that so-called Obamacare put into effect. So even the critique that it was a complete and total giveaway to the insurance industry is a bit of an oversimplification. All right. So even that argument is flawed. So, and I really haven't even gotten more into the accusations of overt fascism yet when it comes to Obamacare. So you can argue that it stabilized private markets or whatever you want to say about that. You can argue it was reformist rather than transformative, but regulated capitalism is not the same as fascist corporatism, or at least not necessarily. You know, it's it's something you have to really delve into and prove, and I don't think this comment successfully did that. So the burden is kind of on you to get more into those details, those specifics, if you're trying to truly convince me of that. And that's not just because I'm a milquetoast, faux progressive liberal or whatever. That's just the way that these things work. The onus of responsibility is supposed to be on you to prove that this is some sort of overt fascist policy here. If anything, fascism historically dismantled liberal democratic institutions. The ACA was passed through ordinary legislative procedures, litigated in courts, and partially modified through later elections. So that's more like textbook liberal democracy, not overt fascism. So, claim number two, it's a joke compared to publicly funded healthcare. So that's a normative position, not so much of an analytical one. A person can prefer single payer, national health service models, or full socialization of healthcare, and that's a coherent ideological stance as far as I'm concerned. But the fact that a reform stops short of public ownership doesn't by itself make it fascist. It just makes it a mixed economy reform, at least in many cases. So, most wealthy democracies actually operate mixed systems. Germany and the Netherlands, from what I understand, they use regulated private insurers. And France blends public and private coverage, from what I understand as well. Correct me if I'm wrong. And even the UK's NHS, again, from what I understand, I believe they purchase services from private providers in some areas. So again, correct me if I'm wrong about that. You don't have to call me a dumbass if I'm wrong. Just correct me if any of that information is false. But none of those systems are classified as overt fascist because they regulate markets or involve private firms. Calling every non-Marxist reform bourgeois let me try saying that again. Bourgeois faux progressivism may be rhetorically satisfying, but it doesn't establish a serious economic classification. So there's a definite category error element to those comments. Um, there's a pattern in both right wing and far left critiques. If a policy preserves capitalism, it's labeled fascism, and that stretches the term beyond usefulness. At least in some ways, I suppose you could make a compelling case that capitalism in general is fascistic, But you really have to lay down a more powerful argument, because if capitalism is more regulated, in ways that actually take the public interest into account, and the marketplace isn't supreme above all else, then it's obviously not the perfect system, but nevertheless, you can't say that the corporations can literally get away with anything and everything. At least not yet, and at least not under Obamacare. In fact, right now, it would perhaps be more fascistic to scrap Obamacare if we were to replace it with nothing. So, fascism is not simply capitalism plus regulation. It's not capitalism that a person dislikes. It's not capitalism that fails to abolish private ownership. I mean, that those things alone do not equal fascism. It is a specific authoritarian political system with a particular historical structure. The ACA was enacted inside a competitive electoral system under judicial review with open opposition, media criticism, and eventual partial rollback. And remember, the insurance industry, at least when it came to some elements of Obamacare, it actually opposed some of those things. So those features that I mentioned, they place it firmly outside fascist political economy. They had parts of it rolled back. You were allowed to criticize it pretty openly. It faced judicial review, and of course, it wasn't just simply something that was imposed by a dictatorship or something like that. So the original comment calls the ACA a gift to capital while also calling it close to fascism. Historically, fascism did not simply hand policy to capital, it subordinated capital to state directed national goals. So business owners could profit, but not independently of regime priorities. So, if the critique is that the ACA was too deferential to market actors, that actually, in some ways, undermines the fascist claim because fascism reduces pluralism. The ACA, in some ways, preserved it. So, what this really is, the argument isn't about fascism, it's about dissatisfaction with reformism. From a Marxist Leninist perspective, incremental social democratic reforms are insufficient because they leave class structures intact. And that's a coherent ideological critique. But that's very different from a historically grounded claim that the policy very closely resembles fascism, or what was the word he said? Extremely close uh, to fascism. So, you can criticize the ACA for entrenching private insurers. You can argue that it failed to establish universal public health care, which I would agree with. And you could argue that it stabilized capitalism rather than challenging it, which I would in some ways agree with. Although, like I said, even that claim falls a little bit short because the insurance companies actually did oppose some elements of Obamacare. So what you can't coherently argue is that Obamacare itself extremely closely resembles fascism, unless fascism just means a form of capitalism that I might oppose. And once the term is stretched that far, it starts to really lose analytical value. So, all right, that's it for this edition, this special episode. And it is refreshing to actually respond to a critique from someone who's not a right winger and who is ostensibly to my left. Although, again, that's debatable. Uh, I don't know this person's other views on things. You'll find that some people have contradictory views, and In this case, there was actually some logical consistency in the argument. I just did not find it to be accurate because you don't just call something fascist just because you kind of oppose it. Well, I guess you can do that, but it just kind of renders the term a little bit meaningless. It kind of reminds me of my dad, who used to call everything communist, like he would learn of some sort of policy or development in society, and he would just say that's communist, or like that's like living under communism or something. It really is actually kind of similar to that because, I criticize Obamacare. I think it could have been much better, and certainly if it's to be replaced, I would hope that something better would replace it. But nevertheless, I would not simply call it some overtly fascist thing. All right, that's the end of the episode. Have a good day.